Asai, great, goeienaand almal. Hallo. Kan al die koffiepotte van langs af nader kom asseblief? Great, koffie area wat ons nou toe maak. Kom neem gee julle plekke. Ek gaan begin in Afrikaans en dan gaan ek eindig in Engels. Is dit okay? Die Engelse deel gaan baie vinnig wees. Okay. Great, guys, before we start, all the guys watching as well, you are so welcome. Just to explain to you how tonight's going to work, net vir verduidelik hoe vanaand werk. Ons gaan 'n sessie hê, dan 'n 45 minute breek, 'n 15 minute breek, ekskuus, weer 'n sessie, 15 minute breek. En dan gaan ons 'n vraesessie aan die einde. Die vraesessie vir die ouens online gaan ons nie uitsaai nie. Ons gaan net die eerste 2 sessies uitsaai. So kry al jou beste vrae bymekaar dat julle ouens reg is om dan nou klomp vrae te vra. Great. So by Lewende Woord is ons familie. So let's just stand up and greet the guy behind you, in front of you, give him a hug, tell him good evening, welcome. Hoe gaan dit? Lekker om jou te sien, hoor. Hallo Poppie, hoe gaan dit? Lekker. Is dit jou maatjie? Yeah. Ja. Jessie. Okay, great guys. So I'm just going to call up John Grobler. Before I introduce him, he's going to introduce his whole team. Lord help us with English tonight. So John was the head of the Bible college where I actually did my degree. And he was the guy that mentored me, spent a lot of time with me. And yeah, so if you have any questions about me, you can ask John and he will just sort you out as well. But John, just come to the front, a very good friend and a mentor, specifically in my life as well. Let's just give him a hand. So John, what an honor to have you here tonight. And I'm just going to pray with you. And Lord, thank you for John. Thank you for the word over his life. And Lord, thank you that there's a road ahead. There's a plan. And as I just look in the Spirit, I just see the road getting bigger and bigger and bigger. In the beginning, I see that it's almost like a little dirt road. And then there was a street road, and now you're taking him to the highway. His ministry is going to go from strength to strength in Jesus' name. And Lord, we honor you for tonight. Thank you that you're going to anchor us in the Word. You're going to give us new revelations. And out of this, we will be confident in you like never before. We love you, Jesus. Amen.
Thank you, JC. It's really great to be here. And we started a ministry apologetics essay last year because I am firmly convinced that the gospel of Christ is the truth and that the truth revealed by God touches every area of life. And so with me, I've got one of my fellow directors, Suzette Ellis. She's sitting in front here. She was also a Bible college student, and God just won her heart. And so she said, well, John, let's get going. So she makes everything, I tell her what to do, she makes it happen, and it runs really well. So thank you, Suzette. Tonight, we have got 2 speakers from the USA. I met Dr. Casey Luskin in 2020 online when I did a seminar on science and culture with the Discovery Institute in the USA. And I invited him last year to come. He couldn't make it last year, but he came this year and he brought 2 colleagues with him. Tonight, the first speaker is going to be Dr. Brian Miller. And he is the research coordinator for the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, Washington, the USA. He holds a BSc in physics. Anybody here enjoy physics? Here's the person you come and ask lots of questions. And he has got a minor with engineering from MIT. Anybody engineers? No? Oh, a couple engineers. He's your man. And then also, he has got a PhD in complex systems in physics. Anybody like physics? All right, here's your man. Come and speak to him afterwards. And so Dr. Brian is going to come and share with you an introduction to intelligent design. And I'm going to leave it up to him to explain it to you. It is really amazing when he gets going. So Brian, please, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's really been a pleasure to be here. And I have to say, this is the highlight for me in Cape Town. Because I've traveled across the world doing talks about design and nature. And usually when I go to a church, a pastor will take me in and I'll see the baptismal and the auditorium. But oh, no. Your pastor took me off-roading. I mean, the mud was flying. It was amazing. So this is really great. And one thing that's interesting, though, that I think you might be wondering is, why am I here? Because I've heard about your church and met a lot of your staff, and I've been so impressed in the stories of the supernatural, of miracles, of prophecy, of casting out demons. Whose lives here has been really transformed by the power of God? I mean, isn't it exciting? So I'm thinking, did they in their staff meeting think, who should we invite to be a guest preacher? And someone said, let's do an evangelist. Someone that can inspire us to share their faith and preach the gospel. And someone's like, no. Let's go for a prophet. Someone that can just reveal the mysteries of God and call out people's hearts. Another staff person said, no, let's get a miracle worker, someone that can pray for the sick. Wouldn't that be awesome? And someone else, and then what happened? Did someone say, no, let's get some nerdy scientists from the United States to talk about physics and fossils? I mean, what's up with that? But I want to explain to you why I'm here. Because I think a lot of times people have this perspective that if you walk in the supernatural power of God, that means you just simply engage the world emotionally, and you kind of will act spontaneously. But I think what a lot of people forget is the character of Jesus. Like if I were to ask you, what is it about Jesus that we should emulate? What character does he wish that he modeled to be in us? What things come to mind? What's that? Love. Great. What else? Relationship. What else? Fellowship. Giving, generosity, holiness. Now, have any of you ever thought Jesus was smart? I mean, that's interesting, right? Because one of the things that Jesus wants to model in us is to use our minds, to understand the culture, to think critically. It's really interesting because when you look at the way Jesus engaged the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, he understood how they thought. He understood their frame of reference. He understood the scriptures. In the same way, God wants us to grow intellectually. And the mind is like a muscle. The more you work it, the stronger it becomes. That's significant. And the other thing I want to just encourage you, and this is from 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 to 5. And he's talking to the Corinthian church. He says, for though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. We take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. And this is an amazing passage because it starts with the idea that we wage war not as the world does, but we have supernatural weapons. Yet, what was he talking about? Demolishing arguments and strongholds. And that's a powerful thing to realize because the intellectual realm and the spiritual realm are interconnected. And what happens is when people are trapped by false philosophies, by false ideas, that puts them into spiritual bondage. And when people fall into spiritual bondage, they then are more susceptible to the false ideas of this world. And when you engage intellectually and you expose the false ideas of this world, the false philosophies, you're actually engaging in exorcism. You're bringing spiritual freedom. I remember I was at Duke University, and I was talking to a freshman, And it was really a remarkable conversation because she was an adamant atheist. And we sat down and we were going to talk about science. And do you ever get into a conversation and you know it's going to be a long, protracted, fisticuffs conversation? And I dug in my heels and I started to talk. And what was amazing, in 2 minutes, she goes, yeah, everything you say makes sense. And then shortly after, she became a Christian. What happened was the Holy Spirit took off the blinders of her mind in terms of the evidence of design in nature. And what happened is when the Holy Spirit broke that intellectual stronghold, it also broke the spiritual stronghold of not recognizing God's existence, and she became a Christian. Interestingly enough, I was in another talk, and I spoke to some students, and a week later, a freshman comes up to me and says he became a Christian. And I said, well, how did you become a Christian? Because he said, when you told me that the evidence points to the fact that I'm not an accident of nature, but I'm created by a designer, I realized that what I thought about science wasn't true, so maybe everything I believed wasn't true. And then he started to explore the possibility of there being a God, and he became a Christian. So what I'm going to do for you is talk about the scientific evidence for a creator. I'm just going to give you a small taste of it. Casey, Dr. Luskin will give you more, and I hope this is just the beginning of your journey, that you're going to be discipled in how to think critically and how to understand how the science points to a creator. Are we excited? Okay, so let's begin. Because when I was in college, I wanted to serve God, but what happened is I read a man named Richard Dawkins. And if you're not familiar with Richard Dawkins, he's one of the patron saints of atheism. He wrote a book called The God Delusion, which I think speaks for itself. And he argued that when you look at nature, you see no evidence of design, that it looks like we're simply an accident of nature. And I said to myself, if that's true, then Christianity is a psychological crutch. And I became convinced, reading him and listening to other scientists, that either you're a person of science, you're objective, you look at evidence, or you're a person of faith who's more emotional, who just is gullible and believes what they're told. I mean, anyone hear that sense that there's kind of a conflict between faith and science? Well, it's interesting because I said, God, I don't know if you exist. I'm kind of convinced you don't. But if you do exist, you have to prove it to me. Because I'm a scientist, I just can't believe this blindly. But I said, if you do prove it to me, I will follow you with all of my heart, whatever the cost. Then God intervened in my life and brought me in contact with leading scientists, philosophers, people that showed the evidence for the resurrection. And I found something very powerful and true, that a little science can take a person away from God, but a lot of science brings them back. So let's talk about the science. So let's go to the next slide. Now, what's interesting is people think that the debate about design in nature is fairly modern. It just sort of happened recently. Maybe it was with the time of Darwin, or in the United States, we have a famous trial called the Scopes trial. But this debate goes back to 500 BC between philosophers like Democritus and Plato. And some of the philosophers like Democritus were materialists. Now, when I say materialism, what I don't mean is that people that like lots of money and nice cars and expensive clothes. That's not what I mean. When I say materialism or a materialist, I mean people that believe that all that exists is matter, energy, space, and time. So that everything we see in the world is simply a product of natural processes, physical laws, chance, and time. That's what I mean by a materialist. And that was what was a very common philosophy at that time period. But what happened is there are other philosophers, like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, that believed in design. They believed that when you saw the world, you saw evidence of a mind in the orderly arrangement of parts and animals in the design of our planet. In fact, when the Apostle Paul talked about how when you look at nature, his character, his nature, his power is self-evident, but people suppress the truth. That's Romans 1, chapter, verses 18 to 20. He was engaging in the same debate happening today. He was affirming the people that believed that you see design in nature, particularly biology, and he was opposing the scientific materialists of his day that said everything was just chance and time. So this is not a new debate. What happened is when the church grew in the first several centuries, the pendulum of philosophy swung strongly to design. People just said, we see design in nature, it's self-evident. If you read the church fathers, you read early Christian leaders, it was just taken for granted. What happened, though, is during what's called the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason, which is a bit of an oxymoron, what happened is the pendulum swang back to materialism, skepticism. The idea that design is simply an illusion. There is no design. And particularly with people like Charles Darwin, people became convinced that the world was simply a product of chance and time. What's happened, though, is in the last century, particularly the last decades, there's been growing amounts of evidence that's causing the pendulum to swing back. That the evidence of design is growing stronger and stronger in every field of science. So let's look at some of that. Like, this is a great illustration of our universe. Let's imagine that someone bought you a universe starter kit, and it looks like this mixer board. So you can create your own universes. Isn't that awesome? So these dials set different parameters of the universe. Some control things like this: the force between electrons and protons and atoms. Other dials control things like the force that holds the nucleus together. Other dials control the force of gravity, the disorder in the universe. Of you setting the dials, you hit the button, boom, a universe pops out. You kind of twist the knob and you see how that universe develops. The chance of the universe supporting life is virtually nil, because many of those dials have to be carefully set for life to exist. And there's several dozen dials. Now, how careful are we talking about? Well, some dials would be like if the dial was between 1 and 100, you'd have to set it between like 17 and 25. So you have to get that dial right. Others are more extreme. Could we go back one slide? Back one slide, please. There we go. But what about gravity? Let's talk about the precision with gravity. That would be, you'd have to set with the precision of one part, that's like one number out of 10 to the power of 35. That's a 1 with 35 zeros behind it. How precise is that? Like, you may not be into math. I know there's some actuaries out there, so you get this, right? But if math is something that causes you trauma, just turn your head. I don't mean to cause you trauma. But let's talk about an analogy. Imagine that you shoot guns. And I usually will ask the audience, who thinks they're the best marksman in this audience? I don't need to do that. Your pastor is. Because I was talking to him. I said, well, how good are you? And he goes, oh, yeah, I can shoot a springbok at 500 meters. And he's talking about how, the rotation of the earth, you have to compensate with this and the winds. I'm like, dang, that's awesome. So he can shoot a target at 500 meters. That's pretty good, right? But the precision needed to set gravity, to allow for life, to allow for stable stars that produce the right radiation, it would be like you're shooting a target that's 1 centimeter in diameter at the other end of our solar system. That's the precision necessary to set gravity to support life. Sorry, you're not even close. Oh, but it gets even better. Here's another one for you. This is what's called, let's go to the next slide, is called the cosmological constant. Ooh, that's a big sciencey word. It's not that hard. What happens is there's sort of an energy that permeates space, and there's other factors that causes space to expand. So that's kind of like one of your dials. If you set that number too large, what happens is the universe flies apart. I mean, like a proton every mile or kilometer away from each other. Just a weak soup, no life. If you set the dials too small, like in the negative zone, then everything compacts itself really fast. So to get that dial right, to support life, you have to be right to 1 part in 10 to the power of 90. That's a 1 with 90 zeros. That's like hitting a target 1 centimeter in diameter at the other end of the visible universe. Not going to happen. Next slide. There's a famous physicist named Fred Hoyle, and he was an atheist. But he said, when I look at how our universe appears to be designed at life, it challenges my atheism to the core. He said, a common sense interpretation of the data suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics, as well as with chemistry and biology. Atheist, but nevertheless, he's been forced to recognize that our universe looks designed for life. But it gets even better. What you find is there are numerous details about our planet that had to be carefully designed for life. And not just for life, but complex life that can do experimentation and cultural advancement. Life from the pole to the equator. For instance, the air we breathe, you have to have the right amount of oxygen to live. If there's too much oxygen, you ever see like an apple core that kind of rots? That would be your body if we had too much oxygen in our atmosphere. If we had too little, we couldn't have vigorous activity. We have the perfect amount of oxygen to breathe. Also, what happens is we have the perfect amount of nitrogen, because you have to have a certain air pressure, or else either gases would escape that you don't want to escape, or certain gases would not escape that you really want to escape. So we have the perfect atmosphere to have a stable environment. But also, what's amazing is there are 2 types of energy that's useful for life. One is heat to keep us warm. We all know that, right, on a cold day. One is light so that we can see. Also, light is what allows for photosynthesis, that plants absorb light, then use it to create oxygen and food, which is really nice. What happens is our sun produces the exact type of radiation that we need. In addition, the atmosphere only allows the radiation that is useful. What allows the heat through and the light through in that little window you see right there. But it blocks out such nasty radiation as X-rays and microwaves. We also have an ozone layer. There's the remarkable coincidences about our chemistry design that allow for ozone, which blocks ultraviolet radiation. What's also amazing is water also allows only the right radiation to penetrate it. It allows heat and light, but blocks things like X-rays and microwaves. In addition, there's many other factors about our Earth. So for instance, what we see is that our planet is in a solar system with very large planets like Jupiter. And that's kind of cool, but what would happen if Jupiter wasn't there? Well, we would be hit by asteroids a lot more often, and that would be bad. So Jupiter, with its massive field, gravitational field, pulls the asteroids towards it so that we can live. Also, if we look at our planet, we've got a deflector shield. Anyone like Star Trek? Okay, that's what I'm talking about. So in the same way the Enterprise or Discovery has a deflector shield, our planet has a molten core where you have rotating charges that produce a giant magnetic field that protects us from radiation. That's really remarkable. We don't see that very often, particularly in terrestrial planets. Next slide. Also, what's amazing is not only are the details of our planet just right to support life, but they're ideal for scientific investigation and cultural advancement. So it just turns out that the atmosphere that allows us to breathe, the atmosphere that allows the right radiation through, is transparent so that we can view the stars. It just so happens our planet is in the perfect place in our galaxy to view our galaxy and other galaxies as between spiral arms away from dust. It's away from all the radiation of the center and so forth. It just so happens that we have the perfect atmosphere for fire. Because if we had more oxygen or less nitrogen, the fires would burn down all of our forest, kind of like what's happening in California once in a while. If we had too little oxygen, we couldn't produce enough fire to advance technologically, because you need fire to melt metals to produce tools. So here again, we see this convergence of details, not just for life, but for cultural advancement and scientific investigation. There's many more details I could go into, but for sake of time, I think you get the basic idea. But here's one of my favorite examples. This is going to blow you away. You getting excited? Okay, my favorite is vision. Because light has a certain wavelength, kind of like waves on the beach. And it just so happens that light has the perfect wavelength to produce high-resolution vision for an eye the size of a human's eye. Because if the wavelength of light were much longer, eyes would have to be the size of football fields. And I know real football, you kick with your feet, not, you get the idea. It have to be the size of football fields, or else we wouldn't have high-resolution vision. What's also amazing, if you look at the chemistry, we receive light because there's little photoreceptors, and those photoreceptors have to be a certain size to detect photons. And it just so happens that the minimum size for a photoreceptor corresponds to a resolution of vision that matches the resolution of vision because of the optics. So you see this convergence of fine-tuning of design in the physics, in the chemistry, and the biology, pointing to a creator. And this is really significant. And why is it significant? Well, let me give you an analogy. Imagine that you're walking in the woods. You come to a cabin, and this cabin happens to have your favorite food in the refrigerator. That's kind of nice. I like ostrich, by the way. That's one of my favorites. Now lamb, too. And what happens is this particular cabin also happens to have your favorite clothes in the closet that all perfectly match. You think that's kind of nice. But then you kind of go into the living room, and you notice it's the pictures of your friends and relatives on the wall. Okay, that's a little bit creepy. And now you find a cell phone with your best friend's numbers programmed in order. Now, who would say, what an amazing coincidence? No, you would know somebody knew you were coming and designed that cabin with you in mind. In the same way, when you look at the laws of physics, you look at our planet, our sun, our solar system, our moon, you see that someone knew we were coming and designed everything with us in mind. Now, the field that's probably most controversial is the issue of biology. Do we see design in biology? That will really ruffle feathers if you say that, right? Well, let's go to the next slide. What I'm going to do for you is I'm going to give you a little exercise in design detection, and then we'll apply it to biology. But you have to know how to detect design, right? So I'm going to show you a series of pictures, and I want you to decide if the image you see is designed or not designed, okay? And this is an image from space. Now, if you think this is designed, raise your hand. It's an image from space. Okay, a few people? If you don't think it's designed, raise your hand. If you're uncertain, raise your hand. This is an image on Mars. It's not designed. It's just shadows. If you look at it more carefully, it wouldn't really be that. So not designed. But it was ambiguous, right? You really couldn't be sure. Here's another one. So if you think this is designed, raise your hand. Okay? Okay, if you think it's not designed, raise your hand. Okay, if you're not sure, raise your hand. Okay, it's not designed, it's a geode. And the way you can tell that is it has a very geometric shape. And natural processes are really good at making geometric shapes, like salt crystals, right? Plus, it's in a rock, and plus, it's highly irregular. So it's not designed. Okay, we're going to try another one. A little bit rough at first, but okay. Now, who thinks that's designed? Okay. That's actually the product of wind and erosion. Are you doubting me? Wait, wait, whoa. You know I have a PhD, right? I mean, if I tell you it's not designed, you have to believe me, right? Okay. Obviously, that's designed. But how do we know? The reason we know it's designed is because it looks very different from the surrounding rock, right? It's not something a natural process would do. It's highly improbable. I mean, it's very improbable you're going to get a complex shape, right? So improbability and complexity are the same. It's kind of this very complex image, but most importantly, it's specified. It matches a pattern we recognize. It has a purpose. So that's why it has what's called a specified complexity. It's specified because it matches a pattern we recognize. It has a purpose. It's complex because it's a very improbable pattern. You're not going to see that by chance. Specified complexity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you an animation of a molecular machine in a cell. Can we have the volume, possibly? No, if not, that's okay. So what this is what's called ATP synthase. And the cell membrane is above, and you have protons
ATP
flowing.
drifts off into the cell, ready to power some biomechanical reaction. The ATP causes the ADP to bind with an additional phosphate group, creating the ATP energy molecule. And the ATP drifts off into the cell, ready to power some biomechanical reaction. The ATP causes the ADP to bind with an additional phosphate group, creating the ATP energy molecule. And the ATP drifts off into the cell, ready to power some biomechanical reaction. The ATP causes the ADP to bind with an additional phosphate group, creating the ATP energy molecule. And the ATP drifts off into the cell, ready to power some biomechanical reaction.
There you go. So what do you see now? How many of you, when you look at that, does that look like something that would just happen naturally, like it might just appear in that gunk in your barbecue pit? Or does that look designed? How do you know? Because it's highly improbable. It's very complex. It matches human-designed engines. It's like a rotary motor. It has a rotor and a stator. It has a power source. It creates motion. So when you look at life, you see indisputable evidence of design based on the same principles you just used to determine that Mount Rushmore was designed. That's the picture of life. Now, what's also amazing is that in life, you have DNA, and the DNA encodes the information needed to build the ATP synthase. So it has the blueprint encoded, just like, any computer programmers in here? Okay, you know how if you type in like a line of code, it gets converted to ones and zeros in your computer? In the same way, all of the architecture of your cell is converted to not ones and zeros, but A's, T's, and G's. So you have a digital code inside your cell in life. And what happens is that code not only is the blueprint for everything, but it's the operating system that makes everything run. And what you find is it contains large amounts of information, which is a particular type of specified complexity. Richard Dawkins said, let's go back. The machine code of the genes is uncannily computer-like. Apart from differences in jargon, the pages of a molecular biology journal might be interchanged with those of a computer engineering journal. So you see indisputable evidence of a mind. And why does information point to a mind? Do you guys have alphabet soup out here? Kind of soup with letters? Now, what would happen if you had a bowl of alphabet soup, you went upstairs, you came down, and in the alphabet soup says, get a lot of rest, drink a lot of fluids, take care of your cold. How many of you would think that that was just due to the physics of the boiling water? or the chemistry of the pasta. Like, if only I knew more organic chemistry, I could explain this information. No, because the ordering of characters transcends the physics and chemistry of the pasta. A mind put that order there, the information, for a purpose. Now, if you just saw the word Bob, that wouldn't necessarily be a revelation from God, but a long sentence would, because it's both complex and specified. The amount of information necessary for even the simplest cell would be like the story A Christmas Carol in your alphabet soup. Very powerful. Now, what's happened is when you look at life, there's really no question you see design. But what's taken place is a theory has come on the scene in Europe called evolution. And Charles Darwin was a famous proponent of evolution. He came up with the idea of natural selection. And if we go to the next slide. Back one, please. So natural selection is an idea that Charles Darwin came up with. And the basic idea is that you have in a population of organisms variation. Like, some of us in this room are taller, smaller, we have bigger feet, smaller feet, et cetera, darker hair. And what happens is some members of that population will more likely survive. So in this particular illustration, you've got a fox, you've got a dark background, and you've got light and dark mice. Now, which mice do you think are going to be eaten for dinner? Light, because they stand out. So in this population, the light-colored moths die. So what happens to the mice overall over period of time? What do they become? Darker. That's called natural selection. Nature is selecting dark mice, and it's not selecting white mice to survive. That's the idea. So the idea of evolution is that very small change can extend over long periods of time. So not only does a mouse grow darker, but a fish could turn into an amphibian, and then into a reptile, then into something like a shrew, and then into a human. So that small-scale change, a mouse growing darker, can extrapolate over long periods of time to turn a fish into a human. That's the logic of the evolutionary framework. So let's go to the next slide. The next slide. There we go. Now what's happened is what Charles Darwin did was he essentially was able to remove God from creation. Because when people looked at biology, they thought they saw design, for good reason. What Charles Darwin said is that design is an illusion. It's not from a creator, but nature selected, nature molded, nature crafted. So this idea of natural selection was a God substitute. That's the idea. And what happened is this theory gained traction, not purely because of its scientific merits, which were questionable even back then, but philosophically what happened is there were trends in the academy, among the intelligentsia, where people didn't really want to believe in God. Or they thought if God did exist, we want to argue that God has no influence in our world. Now, why is that? Well, I think what happens is for Christians, the idea of purpose is nice, because purpose and meaning means that we have a goal to go towards. It means we've got an eternal destiny. But for others, they don't like it, because when you've got a purpose and there's a calling on your life, that means you can't do everything you want to do. So if you want to do whatever you want to do, the idea of purpose isn't very attractive. In fact, this is a famous a writer named Aldous Huxley, and he was actually the grandchild of Thomas Huxley, who was one of the most vocal proponents of Darwin. He says, a philosopher who finds no meaning in the world is not concerned exclusively with a problem in pure metaphysics. He is also concerned to prove that there is no valid reason why he personally should not do as he wants to do. For myself, as no doubt for most of my friends, the philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument of liberation from a certain system of morality. We objected to the morality because it interfered with our sexual freedom. I have to appreciate his intellectual honesty. Because a lot of people pretend they don't see design in nature because of the science. And that's clearly not the reason. It's a philosophical framework that's captured their minds. And with bad philosophy, with deceptive ideas, becomes spiritual bondage. So what's happened is I work with Dr. Luskin and a whole group of scientists around the world. We're part of what's called the Intelligent Design Research Program. What we do is we study nature with some of the top scientists around and demonstrate the evidence for design in nature. So many people kind of confuse us with like creationism. And what you find with creationists is they're looking at how the Bible relates to science. And that's a very noble task. That's valuable. That's just not us. What we do is we just look at the science and we show that the science points to design. And then we show once you have that assumption, it helps you to do better science. You make more accurate predictions. You gain greater insights in the world. That's who we are. That's what we do, and it's very exciting. What we also do is we critique the evolutionary framework because it's a designer substitute, and the science is in a state of collapse. Because what you read in your typical textbook is sort of this watered-down version of the arguments for evolution, and all the arguments that you have this process of natural selection can create large-scale changes. The arguments are based on outdated science, misinformation, and circular reasoning. And when you look at the latest science, the latest literature by experts in the field, what you find is the evolutionary framework, what's often referred to as neo-Darwinism, the modern synthesis, Darwinism, is not true. So for instance, the Darwinian framework says that you've got a cell that formed millions of years ago. It became more complex, and then it branched into different branches that are animals and plants and other organisms. Those branches broke into smaller branches, were like the vertebrates. They broke into smaller branches like mammals and eventually us. So everything is connected through a tree of life. So the idea is that if you look in the dirt, you dig in the soil, you eventually see fossils, bones of extinct creatures, and you should see this gradual development of one organism changing into another. What's happened is the evidence shows the exact opposite. This is a clear picture. What each of these lines represent is the fact that whenever you see some new creature in the fossil record, which is the record of extinct creatures, everything appears suddenly and then does not change. That's a pattern. And when you hear terms like transitional fossils and intermediates, they don't mean what you think they mean. And Casey Luskin will flesh that out with the human fossils. And the same thing that Casey talks about will apply to all fossils. So that's really important. So what we see is things appear suddenly and do not change. Not to mention that if you look at all mutations, and mutations are changes in your DNA that are random, what you don't see is X-Men. What you don't see is mutations radically altering an organism. All mutations that create large-scale changes are harmful. Every shred of empirical evidence we have demonstrate that evolutionary processes do not make large-scale changes. In fact, there was a conference called the Royal Society of London, which is one of the most prestigious scientific organizations in the world. They had a conference on new trends in evolutionary biology, and Gert Mueller gave an opening talk where he talked about how the standard evolutionary model, what you read in your textbooks, cannot explain anything of significance. It could explain how you could, let's say, crossbreed a dog to get a big dog or a small dog. It cannot explain how one organism can change into anything significantly different. Now, in this conference, what they did is they presented lots of other theories, extensions. Not one shred of evidence was presented that any mechanism could drive a large-scale transformation or do anything creative. That's a problem. And what's happened is a lot of the researchers that Dr. Luskin and I work with have shown rigorously that no evolutionary process, no process without a mind could help create anything radically new. One of our researchers has looked greatly, some of our researchers have looked at proteins. What are proteins? Well, proteins are the building block of your cells. Some of you in biology may be having flashbacks or post-traumatic syndrome. I apologize for that. But what happens is most of the brick and mortar of your cells are proteins. So what are proteins? Let's go to the next slide. Proteins are chains of what are called amino acids. And there's 20 standard amino acids. There are a few others in certain circumstances. But there's 20 main amino acids, which are like letters in an alphabet. And those letters have to be in a very, very specific sequence, or the protein doesn't work. Kind of like if you put letters in a sentence, the letters have to be in the right order for you to have a sentence that makes sense. Randomly sequenced letters make no sense. Same thing with proteins. So what you find is one example are enzymes. So what happens is if you've got the right sequence of letters for these amino acids, they fold into a three-dimensional shape and they do something useful. Like this one is breaking apart two sugars into individual sugars. Other proteins are like the components of molecular machines. Other proteins do a whole host of different things, like muscle tissue is what you're most familiar with. I mean, you eat lots of meat around here. That's proteins. I love the meat around here. What happens is the question is, how likely is it for a random sequence of amino acids to fold into a protein that works? Because if it's very easy, then evolution might be true, right? You know, you get a gene duplication, some random mutations, and voila, a new protein. But if it's extremely rare, then it's not likely going to happen. So how rare is it? Well, as it turns out, the research of Doug Axe, who's one of the leaders in the field, showed that the probability for part of a protein that's 153 amino acids long, and that's a pretty small protein, the chance of it functioning is 1 chance in 10 to the power of 77. That's a 1 with 77 zeros. That would be like if you took one atom in 1,000,000 galaxies and you marked that atom, and then you said, go choose one of those atoms by chance, and just pick any random atom, and for you to pick that one marked atom out of 1,000,000 galaxies is the probability of a random sequence forming part of a simple protein. What that means is there is no possibility of any evolutionary process, any mechanism known or unknown, to produce a protein without a mind. It is a mathematical impossibility. So what we've shown through many other research projects is no evolutionary process can do anything truly creative. But it gets much better than that. I mean, this is exciting because this is fresh off the press. One thing I've been working with is engineers and biologists. And what you see is a revolution taking place in biology. Because what's happened is engineers have come into biology and offered a perspective, a set of tools, a set of insights that are changing the very foundations of biological research. And other biologists are doing that also. Because if you believe life is simply a product of chance, time, natural selection, random mutations, there are certain expectations. One is that life should look badly designed. Here's a book, it's called Human Errors, a panorama of our glitches from pointless bones to broken genes by Nathan Lenz. He's a biologist. Let's read what Lenz has to say. We have retinas that face backward, the stump of a tail, and way too many bones in our wrists. We have nerves that take bizarre paths, muscles that attach to nothing, and lymph nodes that do more harm than good. Our genomes are filled with genes that don't work, chromosomes that break, and viral carcasses from past infections. In other words, the human body is so badly designed. It's clear that we just evolved, right? He talks about how you've got all these useless bones in your ankles, kind of like you can shake it like a maraca, I suppose. Now, here's another scientist, I'll mention him shortly, who talks about this idea of how life should look like Rube Goldberg machines. Rube Goldberg was a cartoonist, and what he did is he showed these ridiculous contraptions that are built from parts that weren't designed to be part of the contraption. Like this is a device that wipes your chin with a napkin that's composed of a spoon, with a cracker, with a parrot, with a bucket, with a clock and a rocket. And then it works, right? But it's ridiculously clumsy. It's terribly inefficient and unnecessarily complex. That's what life should look like based on the evolutionary theory, because there's no mind, right? So you have a protein that forms here, a bone that forms here. They kind of slosh around, and eventually, through chance, they come together to do something more complex. That's a Rube Goldberg machine. That's what life should look like. This is an atheist, an evolutionary biologist. He says, indeed, the uniform experience of scientists who work in these systems is that they embody an absurd Rube Goldberg-like complexity that makes no sense as the handiwork of an engineer, but makes perfect sense as the product of a long and unguided process. Now, I appreciate Nathan Lentz and Jerry Coyne because they're so consistent with their philosophical framework. They're atheists, right? Everything they said makes perfect sense if everything is a product of evolution. I also appreciate them because they were so spectacularly wrong. Nothing they said was true. Like, let me give you one example. This is the photoreceptors of eyes. And it's surprising at first glance because the photoreceptors, which detect light, point backwards instead of forward. So light actually has to go through tissues to get to your photoreceptors. And people said, that's a stupid design. No engineer would ever do that. Do you know why they said that? Because they're not engineers. Because what's happened is when people have studied these photoreceptors, they realize they have to face backwards. Because what happens is they burn out really easily. So the photoreceptors are embedded into the epithelium tissue, and the interaction of the tissue actually sheds off burned out discs that no longer work that replenish the photoreceptors. If the photoreceptors faced forward, they would stop working pretty fast. In addition, you've got cells that act like photo-optic cables that directly bring the light to the photoreceptors. So the design of the eye is optimal and ingenious. Let's go to another example. So remember I told you how Nathan Lentz said we've got 7 pointless bones on our ankles? Well, an engineer actually studied what he said. This is an engineer. His name is Stuart Burgess. He's one of the top engineers in the United Kingdom. He's an expert in what's called biomimicry, where he copies the designs of life and applies them in engineering. He studied the ankle-foot complex, and what he found was that for the ankle-foot complex to act optimally, it has to do many things at once. You have to walk, you have to jump, you have to squat, you have to be able to walk on terrain, so your ankle has to roll. What they found is that for all of the needs of the ankle and the foot, ours are optimally designed. You can't design them better. So what happens constantly is people who are biologists who don't study engineering will look at something and think, well, that's not the way I would do it. That's badly designed. All you stupid Christians, there's no design. It's all just evolution. But when engineers look at it, they think, oh, I see exactly why it's designed. Let's go to the next one. Here's a wonderful book. It's called System Modeling in Cellular Biology. And this, again, is out of MIT, no bias, but they have systems biologists and engineers working together. And here's what they comment. An often noted reservation against the type of analogies between biological and engineered systems we brought forward states that these two types of complex systems arise in fundamentally different ways, namely through evolution versus purpose-driven top-down design. So what they realize is that life shows purpose-driven top-down design. What does that mean? Well, top-down design means you look at the top of the organizational hierarchy. So you plan out the major systems in advance. Then you design each individual system to perfectly work with every other system. So every detail is perfectly integrated for the whole purpose that it's predetermined for. In fact, you typically see that multiple parts have to be working at once, and there's multiple constraints that have to be in place at once, or it will not work. That's what you see in life is purpose-driven, top-down design. The idea that life is a Rube Goldberg machine is complete and utter nonsense. Let's go to another quote. What's really amazing, too, is what you find is biologists are now working with engineers, and I have a whole team that I work with, and I have several systems engineers working with biologists. Any systems engineers in here, by the way? That's fine. What happens is when systems engineers look at life, they see evidence of design that is so obvious that for them, it's just ludicrous that people deny it. Because systems engineers know how to make many different systems work together. It is hard. And what happens is, this is a wonderful book written by Steve Loftman and Howard Glicksman, who is a systems engineer and a biologist, and they looked at the human body. And let's go to the next page. And here's what you really see in systems engineering. What you see is that system-level interfaces must be established, communications and interoperability requirements must be established, data flows defined, and operational concepts refined. So what happened is Steve Loftman and Howard Glicksman showed how the principles of system engineering demonstrate why life is designed the way it is. So they showed all these things mentioned. Let's go to the next slide. So here's a great example. Here's your hearing system. The way it works is you've got the eardrum, which is like your sound receiver. It's connected to 3 bones that actually create a double hinge lever arm. It's connected to what's called the cochlea, which is a fluid-filled organelle. And what happens is when the sound hits the eardrum, it moves the eardrum. Let's go to the next slide, actually. And it causes three bones to move, which then hits what's called the oval window, and that sends sound waves through the cochlea. Let's go back. Let's go back. And what happens is for that to work, you have to have a systems engineer to design it properly. So for instance, you have to have interfaces. One of the challenges is that the resistance of sound through air is different through a fluid. So if the air just hit the eardrum and then directly transmitted the sound to the cochlea, most of the energy would bounce back. So what happens is the lever arm and the window sizes are perfectly designed to match the impedances so the energy is not lost. That is not easy. In addition, what do you see also? Risk management. Oh, you'll love this. You don't see it, but there are little muscles that attach to these small bones. And what happens is if you hear a loud sound, the noise would damage these little hair cells in your cochlea. So there's a feedback loop. So if the sound is too loud, your brain detects that. It sends a feedback loop to pull the muscle to prevent the sound from damaging your cochlea. Risk management. You have signal transmission. What's amazing, oh, you're gonna love this. This membrane here gets smaller and smaller. So different parts of the membrane vibrate with different frequencies. And there's hair cells designed to move when those parts of the membrane vibrate. So you have separate signals to the brain for each separate frequency. No small feat. Oh, and you've got adaptation. Because what happens is, let's imagine you hear a constant sound like, what would happen is that sound could drown out other sounds, but your hair cells, which are the triggers inside of that fluid, they adapt so they become less sensitive to sounds that are persistent so you can hear changes in sounds more effectively. So when a systems engineer studies the cochlea or any other biological system, they are thinking God's thoughts after them because they understand the logic, the perspective, the design framework in life. In other words, the evidence of design in nature is so clear, so obvious, that to deny it, you have to suppress the truth. Thank you.
Great, guys. Let's just take a 15-minute break and then we come back after that. So go and get a coffee, cool drink, whatever, and see you guys in 15 minutes. 15:15. Thank you.
There's a green light now. Welcome, folks. Now we got the privilege of having Dr. Casey Luskin. He is a scientist and an attorney with graduate degrees in science and law. He actually spent 4 years in Johannesburg in South Africa doing his PhD in geology. And he married an ex-South African lady, so he's really cool. So Casey, let me not take too much of your time because I think you've got much to say.
Okay, thank you, John. So this is actually kind of bittersweet for me. This is actually my last presentation of this 2-week speaking tour in South Africa. We have given, I just counted them up. This is my 22nd presentation in the last 2 weeks, you guys. So if there's a reason why my voice is a little bit hoarse tonight, that's why. We've really been speaking a lot. But I want to thank you guys for having me. Thank you, Pastor JC, for having us. It's really great to be here with you guys. And yes, I did marry an ex-South African. In fact, I won't embarrass him, but I even have a South African relative in the audience tonight. Thanks for coming. And it's great. South Africa holds a very special place in my heart and my wife's heart as well. We really love this country. In fact, whenever we would come down to the Cape when we lived here to visit family and friends, we would always say, why did I pick the University of Johannesburg for my PhD? Why didn't I pick the University of Cape Town? Oh my gosh, it's so beautiful here, you guys. When people would always ask me in Johannesburg, what do you miss most about the United States? I would always give the same answer. Being able to walk across the street, okay? But here, oh my gosh, we're driving here tonight, and there's young girls going for jogs along the street. You would never see that in Johannesburg. I was just blown away. So you guys live in a very beautiful place, and I really love the Cape Town area. Yeah, so this is going to be a little bit challenging tonight because this is going to be a bit of a heavy-duty talk, just to prepare you guys. We're going to talk about human origins and whether or not there is fossil evidence that shows that we evolved from ape-like ancestors. And my PhD research at the University of Johannesburg, let's see, is this going? Okay, my PhD research was on the early plate tectonic history of South Africa. So I did not actually study hominid fossils and the sort of early human origins question. I studied more like very ancient rocks on the planet Earth. However, this is a topic that I'm very, very interested in, and there we go. So how many of you have ever been to the Maripang Hominid Fossil Museum up in the cradle of humankind? Okay, great, a few people, awesome. So when I lived in Melville, actually, if I turned down my street, went 3 houses down the street, then turned left, and then drove on that road for about 45 minutes, I would slam right into the cradle of humankind. We were a very short distance from there, and so we actually did visit the cradle of humankind quite a few times when I was living here in South Africa. In fact, we had a number of opportunities to go to the Maripang Hominid Fossil Museum, and it's a wonderful museum. It's one of the most probably famous and premier hominid fossil museums in the world. And so if you guys haven't been there, I would encourage you guys to go. You will get an indoctrination and sort of the evolutionary materialist view of human origins. Brian, I think you explained what we mean by materialism, right? We're not talking about, Madonna, material girl, that kind of thing. We're talking about the idea that all that exists is matter and energy. And when we try to explain how humans evolved, the only forces and causes that you are allowed to invoke would be basically matter, energy, the laws of physics, laws of chemistry. That's it. There is no room for, say, an intelligent being to be involved in the origin of the human species. You're not allowed to invoke divine intervention or actions of God or any of that. You're only allowed to invoke strictly unguided evolutionary mechanisms. And you see this reflected at the Maripang Hominid Fossil Museum. We'll talk about the museum more as the talk goes on. But yeah, when I lived here, I definitely had some opportunities to go to this to the Cradle of Humankind, visit some of the hominid fossil sites, had some wonderful tours of the Cradle of Humankind hominid fossil sites. And in one case, I actually had the opportunity to assist with a sampling expedition at the Cradle of Humankind. This was really fun. My lab got to go and do some paleomagnetic sampling. This is me standing in a cave there, and this cave was actually famous for having large cat fossils. So that is the sort of the skull with, you can see the jawbone there of a large cat embedded in the cave wall. Kind of a crazy thing to think about. You know, there's this huge cat running around, and now it's basically lodged in this cave wall. It's been fossilized, and we're just standing right next to it. So, but it's a really fascinating place to go. So I had lots of opportunities to learn about and study the hominid fossils and ask the question, does the evolutionary story supposedly explaining how humans evolved from ape-like ancestors, does that story actually add up? Is the scientific evidence consistent with the claim that we often hear that humans evolved from ape-like ancestors? So we're going to talk about that tonight, a little outline of where we're going to go. We're first going to talk about the evolutionary view, and so I'm probably going to stand off to the side a bit, you guys, so I can not have my back to you, but also read the slides here a little bit. So we're going to talk about the evolutionary view. It's always important to understand different viewpoints if you're going to talk about them, and especially if you're going to critique them. In fact, when I was an undergraduate and also a graduate student, almost every single elective course opportunity that I had, I would take courses in evolution. And it wasn't necessarily because I was sold on evolution, it was because I wanted to understand it. I wanted to see if the evidence was really there. And so I would encourage you guys, you know, if you have opportunities to study evolution, don't pass up on that. My experience was that the more courses in evolution that I took, the more skeptical I became, because I actually started to see that the evidence supporting these evolutionary claims really was not there. And a lot of this had to do with the fossil evidence. We're going to then talk about the field of paleoanthropology. What is this field? Why do we say that the field is fragmented? Then we'll get into the fossils. We'll talk about some of the early hominins, some of the earliest species, which are supposed to represent some of the first species that branched off from the line that supposedly led to modern apes and instead led to living human beings. We'll then talk about a certain group of hominids called the Australopithecines, that you may have heard of this name before, but they're supposed to be directly ancestral to human beings. Anybody, who can tell me, what is the species name of human beings? Homo sapiens. In Latin, it means wise man. So if you want to get into the field of taxonomy, we would be in the genus Homo and the species Sapiens. Okay, so we're going to talk a lot tonight about how our genus Homo arose. Homo is basically a genus of hominids that is, and most of the members of the genus Homo are very human-like. And so when we talk about the origin of the genus Homo, we're talking about the origin of the first human-like species in the fossil record, which I would say actually probably were human. We're going to go over some potential intermediate links that have been cited, including some species discovered here in South Africa. And then we'll talk about the origin of our genus Homo, how it does not appear in this gradual manner that is predicted by Darwin's theory, and how the major members of the genus Homo are actually very human-like and even should be considered members of our own species. So let's talk about this field of paleoanthropology. So paleoanthropology is a subfield of the discipline of anthropology, which studies human origins, specifically hominid fossils and human origins. And the mainstream view of paleoanthropology claims that humans evolved via strictly unguided Darwinian evolutionary mechanisms. And there was no room for involvement by an intelligent designer, by God, by a divine being, or any of that. This is strictly disallowed. And the way that it is framed, according to the standard evolutionary view, is that it said that we would share a common ancestor with apes. They would never say that we evolved from apes. Apes are a living species, so we're not evolving from apes. They're a living group of organisms. So we don't evolve from apes, but we would share a common ancestor with apes, according to the standard evolutionary view. But according to the way that they approach the science, they would claim, even before they even start looking at the evidence, they would exclude the possibility that there has been anything other than natural causes. And so it took me a while to sort of appreciate this fact. So it's an assumption that these scientists make in this field, that there has been no divine action, no intelligent design, no acts of God whatsoever in the history of life. This is not a conclusion of a careful study of the data. This is a starting assumption that they start with before they even start to build their theories and their models, okay? So I think Brian asked if there were any computer programmers in the room. I think we saw one hand go up. Any computer? Okay, yeah. So I did quite a bit of computer programming during my PhD. I think I wrote about 30,000 lines of Python code. It was not fun, let me tell you. But in computer programming, we have this saying that goes garbage in, garbage out, right? If your code is no good, you're going to get bad output. The same is kind of true when you're dealing with science. Bad assumptions will lead to bad conclusions. So if you start with the assumption that there has been no intelligent design, no acts of God, no divine intervention whatsoever, should we be surprised that then they come to the conclusion that there has been no intelligent design, no divine intervention, no acts of God whatsoever. No, it simply reflects their starting assumptions, okay? So we need to be able to distinguish between what are the careful conclusions of a scientific analysis versus what are the assumptions that are built into the very scientific fields themselves. And this is part of what I learned when I was studying evolution in schools, is to always look for the assumptions that go into the arguments and the claims being made. You have to always be willing to think critically, look for the assumptions, and ask yourself, are these valid assumptions, or are these assumptions that maybe we ought to be questioning? And I think in the field of evolution, we see lots of assumptions that really do not hold up, and we can talk about that more during the Q&A. So if you think of that old famous story, somebody was asking about the Hindu view of the earth, which says that the earth rests on the back of a turtle, right? I frankly am skeptical of that, but somebody said, okay, well, what is the turtle standing on? And they said, oh, well, it's turtles all the way down. Well, according to the evolutionary view, it is, instead of turtles all the way down, it is natural causes all the way down. So you see sort of Darwin holding up the earth all the way down. So again, how do they know this? How do they know that there's been nothing but natural causes in the entire history of life, the entire history of the universe, the entire history of everything? The answer is what? They don't actually know that. Just for the record, this is no secret. They don't actually know that it has been only natural causes all the way down. This is an assumption that is made by the scientific community. It is readily admitted when you dig into the actual writings of evolutionary scientists. They will admit, yes, we are assuming what they call methodological naturalism. Methodological naturalism is the view that, even if there is something other than matter and energy, we're going to ignore that when we do science. We're going to pretend as if there are no supernatural actions, no supernatural beings, no supernatural involvement. We're going to, for the sake of doing science, we're going to pretend at least all that exists is matter and energy, and that's going to be our starting assumption. So you put on these philosophical blinders, basically, that excludes the possibility of any divine action, and you work from there. And that is how the field of evolutionary paleoanthropology works. It really, truly is that simple, okay? So when people tell you that God has had no involvement and we evolved from ape-like ancestors, that reflects a philosophy that is guiding the way they think about the topic. It is not a conclusion that is demanded by the evidence. We're going to talk about why the evidence does not demand that tonight. Now, before I critique things too much, I want to say some positive things about this field and about South Africa in particular. The country of South Africa, to your credit, is one of the most spectacular places to find hominid fossils in the world. Thinking of the cradle of humankind, but also other sites, some sites down here near the Cape like Saldanha, the Blombos Cave, and the Classies River Caves have some Stone Age sites. That Taung child site produced one of the first known hominid fossils, this baby Australopithecine. And in the cradle of humankind, of course, you have many fossil sites that have been discovered, including the Homo naledi site, which is far and away the biggest treasure trove of hominid fossil bones ever discovered. We'll talk about that more as this discussion goes on. Now, these are all, we're just saying, we found fossils here. That doesn't necessarily mean that these were human ancestors or non-human species that, we evolved from. That's a separate question. But we do have to give credit to your country that there's been a lot of wonderful fossil discoveries made here. So about, I guess now it would be 13 or 14 years ago, Discovery Institute, where I work, was involved with a major sort of debate over how to teach evolution in public schools in the state of Texas. And we actually went and testified before the Texas State Board of Education on how to teach evolution. And the way that we think evolution should be taught at Discovery Institute is we think that students should be exposed to both the scientific evidence for and against evolution. If you go and read Wikipedia, don't necessarily recommend it as a very trustworthy source of information on many of these topics, but if you read Wikipedia, they will say things like, oh, Discovery Institute is trying to remove evolution from the schools. That is absolutely not true. We think schools should teach evolution. It has been very influential in modern biology, but we say that when you do teach it objectively. Don't just teach the evidence for evolution, teach the evidence both for and against the evolutionary model. Let students weigh the evidence, use their critical thinking skills, and make up their own minds. That's the way education is supposed to work. So we were in Texas basically saying, let's teach the controversy over the scientific theory of evolution. Unfortunately, there were some folks on the other side who had a different approach to teaching evolution, and they were saying you should basically teach only the evidence for evolution, and you should effectively censor from students any of the evidence that challenges evolution. I don't use that word censorship lightly, but I've been involved as an attorney in education battles in the U.S. for about 18 years now, and we see this over and over and over again, that what we affectionately call the evolution lobby is really advocating for censorship to basically disallow students from being able to hear about peer-reviewed scientific evidence that challenges the evolutionary claims that are made in textbooks. And I think this is really doing students a great disservice. But one of the scientists who testified sort of for this, what I would call the one-sided teaching of evolution, was a professor at Southern Methodist University named Ronald Wetherington. And he got up and testified, he's an anthropologist, he got up and testified about the evidence for human evolution. And this is what he said. He said that human evolution has arguably the most complete sequence of fossil succession of any mammal in the world. No gaps, no lack of transitional fossils. And he went on to say that human origins provides a nice, clean example of what Darwin thought was a gradualistic evolutionary change. So this is sort of the very standard view that we see presented to the public, okay? We see that, when you read textbooks, when you go to the Maripang Hominid Fossil Museum, have any of you guys watched the new Homo naledi documentary on Netflix? Anybody seen that? Yeah, okay, it just came out recently. I'm right in the middle of it right now. So, when we see this issue talked about to the public, they will present the issue as if the evolutionary story is this very neat, clean story. They have all these transitional fossils documenting how humans evolved in a very slow, gradual Darwinian manner from ape-like creatures. But I was listening to Professor Wetherington talk. I thought, okay, well, I've been reading the technical scientific literature for many years. I was very familiar with the peer-reviewed scientific literature, and I knew what it said. And we're going to talk about this tonight. And I knew that when you read the scientific literature, what you actually find are very readily admitted the fact that there are extreme breaks and gaps in the fossil record, which show that there are actually very large portions of the fossil record where there are missing fossils right where you're supposed to be documenting how the human-like forms evolved. And we don't have good evidence from the fossils of humans evolving from ape-like precursors. So I'm not accusing Professor Wetherington of lying. I'm sure he believed what he said. He's a good scientist. I'm not here to attack him personally in any way. But what he's saying sort of reflects this dumbed-down version of evolution that is often presented to the public that really doesn't get into the technical details of what's really going on with the evidence. So that's what I would like to talk to you guys about tonight. So, how are we doing here? Okay, so somebody recently sent me actually some scans of a biology textbook in Afrikaans. I can't read a word of this, just for the record. Actually, I can read some of the species names, but so forgive me, my Afrikaans is basically yes, I married into a South African family, but I have no Afrikaans, so I apologize. But this also sort of represents the common evolutionary view. You sort of see this progression of very ape-like species leading to the human-like species, okay? And this is actually the logo at the cradle of humankind. And this is this famous ape to man icon of evolution. It kind of starts off with a stooped figure, probably representing something like your little brother or little sister, right? And then eventually it gradually stands up, and you maybe got your math teacher here, and then it gets to you, a fully upright human being, okay? So, but this is sort of the standard evolutionary view, and it's presented in this pictorial manner because we human beings, we respond well to pictures, don't we? We were talking in the car today how some of us are visual learners, some of us are not. You go to like old cathedrals and churches, and what do? They put these stained glass windows up to tell you the stories of the Bible, so you don't even have to necessarily read it to understand what's going on. Well, this picture says a lot, right? I mean, is this really, what happened? Are there fossils documenting that we evolved slowly from, progressively less and less human-like forms? I'm going to argue that the evidence does not show that tonight, but regardless, these are very powerful images. And in fact, we'll get into the images more in just a minute, but I want you guys to understand the basic story of human evolution, because again, if we are going to critique it, it is important for us to understand what is being said. So we first start with what we call the early hominins. These would have been some of the earliest species that branched off the lineage that supposedly led to humans from our common ancestor that we shared with chimpanzees. These would be species like Sahelanthropus chinesensis, Ororantuganensis, or Ardipithecus ramidus. And these fossils tend to be very, very fragmented and are very, very, they're very, very sparse and very difficult for, when you want to move this out of the way here? Okay. Okay, how's that? A little bit better, you guys. Okay, So these would be some of the earliest hominid species, and these are represented by very, very fragmented fossils. We don't have a great idea of what they looked like, but it is claimed that they were some of the first upright walking, or what we say bipedal species that were walking on two legs to evolve. Then we get into a group of hominids called the Australopithecines. And this is a group of hominids for which we actually have a lot more fossils. We have a much better idea of what they probably looked like and who they were. They lived from about 1.5 to 4.5 million years ago, and they are said to be our direct evolutionary ancestors. Then you get into the genus Homo up here in the upper right, and this would be species like Homo habilis, the Neanderthals, Homo erectus, and our species, Homo sapiens, right? And so this is basically representing some of the species that are very human-like and are supposed to be, essentially getting to the human Homo-like form. So we're going to talk about whether there's actual evidence supporting this gradual evolutionary scheme that we often see. We're going to see that hominid fossils generally fit into two categories: ape-like species and human-like species, with a large unbridged gap between them. And the fossil record does not document the evolution of humans from ape-like precursors. So let's also talk about this field of paleoanthropology. I'm going to argue to you guys tonight that the field of paleoanthropology is fragmented in three different ways. Number one, the fossils themselves are fragmented. Number two, the record is fragmented in space and time. And number three, the field of paleoanthropology itself is fragmented. So let's talk about this. This is a quote from Stephen Jay Gould, who was a famous paleontologist at Harvard. In fact, in my family, we used to always say that if you were to take my dad and add about maybe 30 or 40 pounds, he would look exactly like Stephen Jay Gould. We both come from sort of Eastern European Jewish ancestry. But Stephen Jay Gould said that most hominid fossils, even though they serve as a basis for endless speculation and elaborate storytelling, are fragments of jaws and scraps of skulls. Now, of course, we do occasionally find more complete fossils, but this is a very profound statement that he's saying, that most of the fossils that are found are very incomplete. So when they find these incomplete fossils, they will then try to reconstruct what they look like. And we often see these kinds of reconstructions in textbooks. On the left side here, we have, these are supposed to be Neanderthals who are depicted as very unintelligent. They're trying to kill a bear with a club. I have to tell you, I'm not going to kill a bear that's 3 times my size with a club. It's going to eat me long before I kill that bear. So this is clearly not a very smart way to try to kill a bear. But here we're supposed to have an Australopithecine. Now, Australopithecines had a brain that was about the size of a chimpanzee, but this Australopithecine is depicted as if it's having like its first, major glamorous thought in its eyes. But I can guarantee you that the Australopithecines were not having glamorous thoughts, given that their brain was about the size of a chimp. But the one that really gets me is this one. This is actually supposed to be Homo erectus. Now, Homo erectus is supposed to be the first upright walking species of a member of the species or the genus Homo. So it walked upright like us. Yet Homo erectus is depicted all stooped over, okay? This is not the way Homo erectus was walking. So what we see here in these sort of pictorial representations is a very common thing. They're trying to make the ape-like species look more human and the human species look more ape-like, all right? We often see them doing this. These are actually a couple of photos I took at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. And again, we see this is Australopithecus afarensis. This is Lucy's species looking up at the stars, as if she's pondering something very deep. Again, this species had a brain about the size of the chimp. I can pretty much guarantee you that Lucy was not looking up at the stars, wondering about the meaning of life. This species, Australopithecus africanus, is clearly smiling. Maybe apes can have some kind of a jovial thought. I wouldn't be too surprised at that. But again, they're trying to depict these as if they are very human-like. So I think this is a great quote it's actually a very old quote from a Harvard anthropologist named Ernst Huden, but he said that alleged restorations of ancient types of man have very little value, very little of any scientific value, and are likely only to mislead the public. So put not your trust in reconstructions. I think these are words that ought to still be heeded and remembered. And this again is actually a scan of an Afrikaans biology textbook that someone sent me. And again, we just see, these representations. There's a lot, you need to appreciate, there's a lot of subjectivity that goes into these reconstructions. They're really trying to fit things into a model. And maybe it's not completely wrong, but just appreciate that we don't know really exactly what a lot of these things look like, and there's a lot of subjectivity here. So, This is a quote from the journal Science. It's an older quote, but I think it still holds a lot of value. It says, the primary scientific evidence, talking about the field of paleoanthropology, the primary scientific evidence is a pitifully small array of bones from which to construct man's evolutionary history. One anthropologist has compared the task to that of reconstructing the plot of War and Peace with 13 randomly selected pages. Conflicts tend to last longer because it is so difficult to find conclusive evidence to send a theory packing. So because the evidence is so sparse, it's very difficult to, basically come to firm conclusions. This reminds me of a famous quote, why do academics fight so much? Because there's so little at stake, okay? So, but the same thing is kind of going on here. There's so little evidence to go on that basically, people have difficulty saying, oh, you're clearly wrong, or I'm right. And if you read paleoanthropology books, books by scientists in the field, they will regale you with tales of infighting between paleoanthropology research teams. And one team will say, oh, we don't like the way you think, so we're going to deny you access to see our bones that we discovered. And so this is not good for science, because in science, you need to be able to fact check other researchers and see if, they got it right. This is the way science is supposed to work. But unfortunately, in paleoanthropology, and I see this in many of the books I've read, they will tell stories of, one research team disallowing another research team to be able to have access to the data, and it's really not a healthy thing for science. So the fossils themselves are very fragmented. The fossil record is also fragmented. This is a quote from another Harvard evolutionary biologist, Richard Lewontin. He says, when we consider the remote past, before the origin of the actual species Homo sapiens, we are faced with a fragmentary and disconnected fossil record. Despite the excited and optimistic claims that have been made by some paleontologists, no fossil hominid species can be established as our direct ancestor. And even though this was stated in the 1990s, it's still true. The record is very fragmented, and if you ask paleoanthropologists, which species is the direct ancestor of humans, you're going to get 5 different answers, okay? I mean, there's a lot of disagreement in the field about these things. This is a great quote from, how are we doing there? There, Jerry Coyne, who's a very well-known evolutionary biologist. He also has a very prominent blog. Anybody ever heard of Jerry Coyne? He has a very prominent evolution blog online. But he says, paleoanthropology is a field in which the students far outnumber the objects of study. And so I think this is a great quote. We have a lot more people studying these fossils than actual fossils themselves. So the record itself is very fragmented. Now, talking about the field of paleoanthropology also being fragmented, this is a quote from a science writer named Roger Lewin, and he said, an emotionally charged atmosphere permeates paleoanthropology because of something akin to what he calls ancestor worship, causing bitter rivalries such that paleoanthropology literature is replete with references to controversy, disagreements, and even personal battles. And I love this next quote. This is a quote from a PBS Nova producer who is doing a documentary about Neanderthals. And he said that each Neanderthal expert thought the last one I talked to was an idiot, if not an actual Neanderthal. So it just kind of gives you a sense of what's going on in the field. So this field is very fragmented, and evolutionary paleoanthropologists very frequently disagree. So we need to just sort of understand the way the field operates before we dig into the fossils. So I'm really struggling with this clicker, you guys. I mean, I'm clicking like many times. So this is a quote from senior editor of the journal Nature, Henry Gee. And he says that the fossil evidence of human evolutionary history is fragmentary and open to various interpretations. I think this is a very honest and candid quote. I really respect this quote. But the question that I want to ask is, what about non-evolutionary interpretations? Are they allowed? Are we allowed to propose a view of the hominid fossil data that suggests that actually we did not evolve from ape-like creatures? Well, that's what I would like to talk to you all about tonight. So let's talk first about now the early hominins. These are again supposed to be some of the first species that branched off from the other side of the line that led to modern chimpanzees. And these are often said to be some of the first species that were walking upright, that were then the first sort of like hominid ancestors of humans. So around the first year of the millennium, there was a species discovered named Auroran tugensis, which they dubbed Millennium Man. And what we see in the hominid fossil sort of public rhetoric, we see that when these fossils are first discovered, they are often hyped to the public, okay? We see newspaper articles saying, oh, a new human ancestor has been discovered, or, we finally found the missing link. So invariably, when these new fossils are presented to the public, there's a lot of hype that goes on. But what ends up happening is wait a few months, wait 6 months, wait a year or 2 years, let cooler heads prevail, and you will then see that there are peer-reviewed papers that will often be published critiquing those hyped claims that were initially made in the media. Now, unfortunately, we don't then see the media covering these boring papers being covered in the technical journals saying, oh, the original claims that this was a human ancestor are probably false. They just kind of go about their business and move along. But when you read the newspapers, when you watch Discovery Channel, when you watch these Netflix documentaries, they will hype this evidence to no end. So when this species was discovered, they said that these fossils may be the earliest human link. And again, you can see what was actually discovered here. This is kind of what Stephen Jay Gould called a few bone scraps, all right? Now, the good news for the paleoanthropologists, at least, is in this case, they discovered part of a femur. And that's pretty good. You're doing really good in paleoanthropology if you discover part of a femur bone. And that's important for understanding how a species walks. However, there's so little data to go on here that a few years after this species was discovered, there was a Yale University Press book said that all in all, there is currently precious little evidence bearing on how Auroran moved. We really don't have enough evidence to say if it really was an upright walking bipedal species like modern humans. Another species where we see sort of this hyping going on is the species Ardipithecus ramidus. This species was first discovered in the 1990s, and it took about 15 years for them to finally publish the peer-reviewed scientific papers reporting this fossil. But when it was first reported in the year 2009, again, the media kind of went crazy promoting it as the newest human ancestor. So Discovery Channel said, Artie, oldest human ancestor unveiled. The Associated Press said the world's oldest human-linked skeleton found, and Science magazine called it the breakthrough of the year. One of the lead Artie researchers, Tim White, a researcher at UC Berkeley, said that Artie is the Rosetta Stone for understanding bipedalism, meaning that Artie would help us to understand how upright walking evolved and how humans came to walk upright. So one of the problems with Artie is that when this fossil was first discovered, it was in very, very poor condition. And in fact, Time magazine reported some portions of Artie's skeleton were found crushed nearly to smithereens and needed extensive digital reconstruction. So this is sort of a red flag here, okay? When you hear them talking about reconstructing fossils, we need to understand that, when they reconstruct them, there is a paradigm. There's a sort of a model in their heads that is guiding the way they reconstruct the fossils. Maybe that model is right, maybe that model is wrong. But when you're reconstructing a fossil, there's often a lot of subjectivity that will go into these reconstructions. And I think that was certainly the case with Artie. In fact, it was said that initially Artie's pelvis looked like an Irish stew. Now, the pelvis is a very important bone for determining how an organism walks. So if you want to claim that Artie was sort of this initial, one of the first upright walking bipedal species that evolved from this common ancestor that we shared with apes, but the pelvis looks like an Irish stew, that does not inspire a lot of confidence, all right? There were other quotes that said that this fossil initially looked like roadkill. It was squished, it was chalky, it was distorted. Again, it was crushed to smithereens. So these don't inspire a lot of confidence that we really can have a sort of an objective reconstruction of the fossil. And eventually, like I said, the cooler heads did prevail, and there were papers published in top scientific journals criticizing the claim that Artie walked upright. On the left-hand side, we have a quote from the journal Science, which said, all of the Ardipithecus ramidus bipedal characters cited also serve the mechanical requisites of quadrupedality. That's sort of, to translate this, what they're saying is that all of the skeletal traits that they discovered in this fossil could also mean that it was a quadruped, meaning it didn't walk on 2 legs, it walked on 4 legs, and it was not necessarily a bipedal species like we are. And then another leading paleoanthropologist in the journal Nature. By the way, Science and Nature are arguably 2 of the top scientific journals in the world. So this is very, very prestigious papers we're talking about here. But in Nature, a scientist published a paper that said, The claim that Ardipithecus ramidus was a facultative terrestrial biped is vitiated because it is based on highly speculative inferences and on only a relatively few features. So we really don't have a lot of evidence to support the claim that it was a bipedal species. So in fact, one of these scientists said in Time magazine, he said that he regards the hype around Artie to have been overblown. So I really appreciated this quote because finally somebody is sort of calling out the hype that's going on with one of these hominid fossil discoveries. Okay, and then finally, a postscript. Just a couple years ago, there was a study in another scientific journal which found that Artie had the hands of a tree climber and a knuckle walker and used a chimp-like mode of locomotion. So again, Artie is initially presented as the Rosetta Stone for understanding bipedalism, going to help us show how upright bipedal walking evolved from this common ancestor we shared with apes. But then wait a few years and cooler heads prevail, and you see that actually a lot of that evidence did not pan out. What about the Australopithecines? When we're talking about the early hominins, many of these species, we have a very sort of, I would say, poor idea of what they looked like. But with the Australopithecines, we actually do have a fairly good idea, at least a much better idea of what they looked like. So who were the Australopithecines? Well, the name literally means southern ape. They lived about 1.9 to 4.5 million years ago. They had a brain and body about the size of a chimpanzee. And one of the most complete and most famous known Australopithecine specimens is Lucy. I'm sure many of you guys have heard of Lucy. It's a member of the species Australopithecus afarensis. I have a drawing here of Lucy's bones on the right-hand side. And you might think, this is a pretty impressive fossil. It actually turns out that only 40% of Lucy's skeleton was actually uncovered. But they did pretty well because at least they found part of the pelvis, an entire femur, part of a tibia, and that's doing pretty well. So you might actually be able to reconstruct the knee joint there. So in the field of paleoanthropology, if you have part of a pelvis, a part of a tibia, and a femur, you're doing very, very well. So Lucy is actually one of the most complete and famous hominid fossils. And the Australopithecines are said to be directly ancestral to our genus Homo. Although there is a lot of disagreement in the field of paleoanthropology, I do want to say that it probably is the consensus that the Australopithecines were directly ancestral to us. Not everybody would say that. Certainly there's some dissenters, but it's pretty widely agreed. Now, I don't agree. I'm going to give you guys some reasons why I think the evidence does not support that claim, but this is the standard view. So, although they are claimed to be sort of this almost like it has a human-like body, a miniature human-like body that walked upright much like we did, but it had an ape-like head. There are many traits of the Australopithecines that are not human-like and or ape-like. And these include the arms, the hand bones, the striding gait, the shoulders, the brain size, the toes, the chest, the teeth, the developmental patterns, the abdomen, and the inner ear canals. You might think, why do we care about inner ear canals? Well, inner ear canals have a lot to do with how you walk. If you've ever had an inner ear canal or an inner ear infection, it can make you very dizzy. So it turns out that the Australopithecines had inner ear canals that were similar to, essentially, to living apes. So that tells you right there that they maybe didn't walk exactly like we did, even though that's often claimed. So getting back to the way Lucy walked, again, the claim is made that she was sort of like a miniature human with a human-like body, but then a chimp-like head sitting on top of a human-like body. This is actually a photo I took at the Maripang Hominid Fossil Museum, which is supposed to show, that Lucy walked upright much like we did, despite the fact that she had a very chimp-like head. Well, if you dig into the scientific literature, again, you find there's a lot of evidence that counters the claim that Lucy's sort of mode of life and mode of locomotion was just like a modern human. For one, she had the hand bones of a knuckle walker, and an article in Nature said that she knuckle walked as chimps and gorillas do. An article in New Scientist said that many of the traits of Lucy's skeleton were suitable for climbing in trees. And this is actually also pretty widely agreed now that Lucy spent a lot of time in trees. She had sort of an arboreal lifestyle. Now, again, a very important bone for determining how an organism walks would be the pelvis. And it turns out that, kind of like Ardipithecus, Lucy's pelvis, when it was first discovered, was also in very bad condition. And one article in a scientific journal said that the pelvis of Lucy was initially badly crushed with distortion and cracking. And another paper in the Journal of Human Evolution said that when they reconstructed Lucy's pelvis, there was air in the reconstruction, creating a very human-like sacral plane. So you get, again, a lot of subjectivity that goes into these reconstructions. And because of this, there was another article in the Journal of Human Evolution that said, prevailing views of Lucy's posture are almost impossible to reconcile. To resolve such differences, more anatomical fossil evidence is needed. The available data at present are open to widely different interpretations. So I would say that there is disagreement over the way Lucy walked, and it turns out that if you look at Lucy's femur, there's an angle that determines the angle at which the femur angles down from the hips down to the knee. It's called the bicondylar angle. And it turns out that Lucy had a bicondylar angle, and other Australopithecines also had a bicondylar angle, which is much greater than we have in modern humans. So if Lucy was to be walking along, her legs would have wanted to sort of go, 1 foot in front of the other. So you can imagine Lucy living in a tree, having these very long arms, probably holding on to branches above her, but then using, when she was walking upright, she was probably, walking along a tree limb like this, able to put 1 foot in front of the other. So Lucy's mode of upright walking, when she did walk upright, was definitely different from the way that modern humans do, and she certainly spent a lot of time in the trees. I think when she was on the ground, she probably used knuckle walking, because she had the hand bones of a knuckle walker. So we're not talking about a species that walked just like we do. There's certainly some very significant differences. So there was an article in the Journal of Molecular Biology and Evolution that asked the question, is there good evidence that the Australopithecines evolved into our genus Homo? And it said, no gradual series of changes in earlier Australopithecine populations clearly leads to the new species, talking about early Homo. And no Australopithecine species is obviously transitional. And so you can see here on the right, actually a diagram which shows from this paper, this is supposed to be Lucy, and this is supposed to be one of the earliest members of the genus Homo. And even though they're both depicted walking upright, I would question this. There are very significant differences in size and also skeletal shape and the relative proportions of the bones. Another anthropologist said that the Australopithecines are like apes and the Homo group are like humans. Something major occurred when Homo evolved, and it wasn't just in the brain. So there are major differences between the Australopithecines and humans. And I would say again that they probably had a unique form of locomotion that included tree climbing, knuckle walking, and bipedalism that was probably well suited for walking on tree branches. It was not walking exactly like we do. So let's then talk about this question, are there intermediate fossils that document how the Australopithecines evolved into our genus Homo? Well, one species that is often cited is a species called Homo habilis. How many of you guys have heard of Homo habilis before? Probably a very commonly heard name. The name literally means handyman. And so the idea is that Homo habilis was one of the first species to use tools. However, when you look at its skeletal traits, it actually is very different from it is very different from what you would expect from an intermediate between the Australopithecines and humans. An article in the journal Nature said that the skull of Homo habilis represents an unlikely intermediate between the morphologies seen in the Australopithecines and Homo erectus. And an article in the Journal of Human Evolution said, it is difficult to accept an evolutionary sequence in which Homo habilis, with less human-like locomotor adaptations, is intermediate between Australopithecus and fully bipedal Homo erectus. So its skeletal features really do not match what we would expect from an intermediate. In fact, there are various, I'll skip this, there are various studies that found that Homo habilis, actually its body traits, if you look at its body size, its body shape, its locomotion, its jaws and teeth, its development, its brain size, across the board were more like the Australopithecines than they are like the genus Homo. So they really said that it should be called Australopithecus habilis rather than Homo habilis. But what about the claim that it's a habilis, that it was using its hands? Well, this claim is also disputed. This is an article in the journal Science talking about the association of habilis with tools. And they said that this association has subsequently proven highly dubious. It's very difficult to link these tools that you find to any particular species. And although Homo habilis has always been sort of called this tool-using species, there's really not very good evidence that that is the case. So if Homo habilis is really Australopithecus habilis, then we are sort of left without a link between the Australopithecines and the genus Homo, and there's a large gap in the fossil record. This is a problem for the evolutionary story. Well, then comes along Homo naledi. How many of you have heard of Homo naledi? I'm sure many of you guys have heard of this. Homo naledi was first discovered, or reported at least, in 2015 with a lot of fanfare. And once again, we see this hype going on, hyping the species to the public. CNN said, Homo naledi, new species of human ancestor discovered in South Africa. The Daily Mail, scientists discover skull of new human ancestor, Homo naledi. PBS, trove of fossils form a long-lost human ancestor. So this claim was made to the public that Homo naledi is indeed a human ancestor. This was pushed very heavily by the folks who discovered Homo naledi. One of the lead researchers for Homo naledi, Lee Berger at the University of Witwatersrand, who, by the way, deserves a lot of credit. He actually did a huge amount of weight loss so that he himself could get into the cave where they found Homo naledi. Initially, when they found these bones, they actually put out an ad trying to hire very petite females who could squeeze through this very narrow crevice in the cave and be able to get into the actual chamber where the bones were discovered. And Lee Berger was kind of a big guy. He's not going to fit in there, but he did some serious, body work for science, losing weight so he could actually get in there. So I really respect that. But he said this species is quite different from anything else we have seen. But I would disagree with him on the claims that it was a human ancestor. So there are a couple major controversies over Homo naledi. First of all, it was claimed that this chamber in the cave where they found the Homo naledi fossils represents a burial chamber, and that Homo naledi was actually intentionally burying its dead, and this is supposed to represent sort of, this first very high intelligence, human-like culture evolving in our ancestors. However, I would be very skeptical of the claim that Homo naledi was burying its dead, and here's why. Burying dead in the cave where this species was found would require shimmying through a very steep, narrow crevice while dragging a body a long distance in the dark. This would be a physically challenging task for a hominin of any level of intelligence. And many scientists, including some of Lee Berger's colleagues at the University of Witwatersrand, have been very critical of the claim that Homo naledi buried its dead. In fact, one anthropologist said their explanation of Homo naledi repeatedly carrying in their dead over years and putting them in the chamber is tortuous and incredible. I actually think that's probably a fair statement. The other big controversy, though, was over the age of Homo naledi. When Homo naledi was first discovered, the claim that was made is that the species is about 2 to 3 million years old. Why did they say this? Well, I can tell you they did not say this based upon any geological dating. There was no geological dating done initially which established the age of this fossil. The reason they wanted it to be 2 to 3 million years old is because that is exactly when they claim that our genus Homo evolved from Australopithecus. So they sort of came up with this evolutionary derived age of the fossil without any geological evidence to back it up. So finally, a couple years later, in 2017, they actually did date the species Homo naledi, and it turns out to be 1/10 the age of what it was supposed to be if it was a human ancestor. So it turns out that it was dated to about 250 to 300,000 years, and the evolutionary prediction about the age of Homo naledi was wrong, and it is far, far too young to be a human ancestor. Our genus Homo was around long before the species was around, and you obviously cannot be an ancestor of something that is much older than you. That just doesn't work. So all these claims that you saw in the media that Homo naledi is a human ancestor simply cannot be true. The species is far too young by a factor of 10 to be a human ancestor. But what's interesting is that in the year 2010, some of the same species that discovered Homo naledi were promoting a different species as the latest human ancestor, and that is Australopithecus sediba. It was claimed that they make a very good candidate ancestor. But again, it comes after the first appearance of our genus Homo. So if Australopithecus evolved into Homo, but yet this species comes 800,000 years after the first fossils of the genus Homo, it clearly cannot be a human ancestor. So again, these claims are often not corrected in the media, despite the fact that they're initially, this is the Wall Street Journal where it's being called a human ancestor, but it could not have been a human ancestor. Okay, there's another problem here, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but the claim was made from this research team that both Australopithecus sediba and Homo naledi are human ancestors, okay? The problem is that if they were both human ancestors, then key traits are evolving in the wrong direction, because Australopithecus sediba had a pelvis and teeth and hands that were actually more human-like than Homo naledi, okay? So it's very unlikely that both of these species could be ancestors in a human lineage. And in fact, this was said by one scientist who was very critical of that. So what we end up having in the sort of another rhetorical dynamic in this debate is often evolutionary scientists will not admit a problem with their model until they think they've solved it, okay? So when they thought they solved the ancestry of humans when they discovered Australopithecus sediba, they came out and made these claims saying, oh, the ancestry of Homo and its relation to earlier Australopithecines remains unresolved. But then they said, now we've solved it. But then it turns out the fossil can't be a human ancestor, so we're sort of stuck with this confession of ignorance that has not actually been resolved. In fact, there were other confessions of ignorance that were made when they discovered this fossil, and they said the origins of the genus Homo remain as murky as ever, or the transition to Homo continues to be almost totally confusing. How are we doing here? Okay, so now let's talk about the origin of our genus Homo. When we read the technical literature, the first human-like members of the genus Homo appear in the fossil record very abruptly without direct evolutionary precursors, and the technical literature reports an explosion, rapid increase, or punctuated change and approximate doubling of brain size at the appearance of Homo around 2 million years ago. In fact, a study of the pelvises of Australopithecines and Homo found very rapid evolution corresponding to the emergence of the genus Homo. Just for the record, this is not what you want to find when you're trying to find evidence for an evolutionary transition. You don't want to find this, explosion or rapid increase or rapid evolution. You want a slow, gradual evolutionary change. That is what is predicted by Darwin's theory. You don't want this abrupt changes taking place. And this is a longer quote from the paper that I quoted earlier, talking about the lack of a transition between Australopithecus and the genus Homo. And it says that Homo erectus or Homo ergaster, those would have been two of the first very human-like members of the genus Homo, which appear in the fossil record. It says that they were significantly and dramatically different from Australopithecines in virtually every element of its skeleton and every remnant of its behavior. The changes are sudden. No Australopithecine species is obviously transitional. They called it a radical transformation, in other words, a genetic revolution. So again, when you're talking about a genetic revolution, this is not that slow, gradual model of evolution that is predicted by Darwin's theory that we saw at the beginning, where he said that there are no gaps. This is a nice, clean example of gradual Darwinian change. That is definitely not what we see in the fossil record. In fact, one commentator on this evidence called it a Big Bang theory of human evolution. Again, that's the opposite of what you want for a standard evolutionary model of how something evolved. This is a quote from 3 Harvard paleontologists who were talking about the good news and the bad news regarding the origin of our genus Homo. And they said, the transition from Australopithecus to Homo is undoubtedly one of the most critical in its magnitude and consequences. As with many key evolutionary events, there is both good news and bad news. First, the bad news. The bad news is that many details of this transition are obscure because of the paucity of the fossil and archaeological records. So we basically don't have evidence in the fossil record of this transition from Australopithecus to Homo. Okay, well that's pretty bad news. So what is the good news? Well, the good news is they said, although we lack many details about exactly how, when, and where the transition occurred from Australopithecus to Homo, we have sufficient data from before and after the transition to make some inferences about the overall nature of key changes that did occur. So what's really going on here is it says, basically, in other words, the fossil record is providing us with ape-like Australopithecines before and human-like Homo after the supposed transition, but not actual fossils documenting a transition between these two groups. But in the absence of intermediates, we're left with what they call an inference of a transition based upon strictly the assumption of evolution. So this is really not what you want, again, if you're trying to demonstrate some evolutionary transition in the fossil record. This is finally a quote from Ernst Mayr. He's one of the leading evolutionary scientists of the 20th century. And he said that the earliest fossils of Homo are separated from Australopithecus by a large unbridged gap. How can we explain this seeming saltation? A saltation is like a jump, a very abrupt change. Well, he says, not having any fossils that can serve as missing links, we have to fall back on the time-honored method of historical science, the construction of a historical narrative. So what he's saying is we don't have fossils, we don't have these missing links, so we have to construct a narrative. We have to tell a story based upon what we believe happened, not because the evidence is actually there. And in fact, these gaps are actually admitted at the Maripang Hominid Fossil Museum. You have to look very closely, but these question marks that I've highlighted are all key parts of the hominid fossil record, especially this one here is where the genus Homo supposedly evolved from Australopithecus, and here we have a big question mark. And in fact, this problem exists not just for the origin of our genus Homo, but for many hominid species. This is a quote from a major review of hominids fossils from 2015 in a book published by a major science publisher from Germany. It says, the evolutionary sequence for the majority of hominid lineages is unknown. Most hominid taxa, particularly early hominins, have no obvious ancestors, and in most cases, ancestor-descendant sequences, fossil time series cannot be reliably constructed. So the evolutionary view of human origins has some serious problems. Okay, so now let's talk about what we find when we look at the genus Homo, and the members of genus Homo are all very similar to each other, very much like us. So in contrast to the Australopithecines, the major members of Homo, we're talking about Homo erectus and the Neanderthals, are very similar to modern humans. In fact, they're so similar to modern humans that some scientists have proposed that they actually all belong to our species. We're all part of the same species, Homo sapiens. We're not even from different species. This is a comparison of the skulls of Homo erectus, the Neanderthals, and Homo sapiens. And the skull shapes are very similar. Below the neck, we're actually almost identical. But even the skull shapes are very similar. Yes, there are some minor differences, but they're all within the range of what I would say modern human genetic variation. In fact, the average skull size of a Neanderthal is actually bigger than the average skull size of modern humans. And even though the average skull size of Homo erectus is smaller than modern humans, it's still well within the range of modern human genetic variation. So you might see, a lineup of skulls going from very small to very big. But I would say if you see this, don't be too impressed, because the reality is that there is a lot more that is determining intelligence than the sole dimension of brain size. In fact, the president of the Allen Institute for Brain Science in Seattle, where I actually have a friend who works there, and I've been there before to have lunch with them, he says the total brain volume weakly correlates with intelligence. Brain size accounts for between 9 and 16% of overall variability in general intelligence. So if you're one of those small, headed people, small, you wear the small size of the hats when you buy them, don't worry, that doesn't mean that you're not intelligent. Intelligence is not primarily determined by brain size. In fact, as proof of this is a great example. In the 1800s, there was a Russian novelist named Ivan Turgenev, and his brain weighed, when he died, they measured his brain, it weighed about 2 kilograms. But a French novelist from the same period, his brain weight was about 1 kilogram. So Turgenev's brain was literally twice the size of Anatole France's brain, but yet they were both very famous novelists of the 1800s. So don't worry again if you have a small brain. Doesn't necessarily mean you're not smart. Internal brain organization is much more complex and important for determining intelligence than is the sole dimension of brain size. What about Homo erectus? Well, we've actually we don't have a lot of good, hard archaeological evidence about how smart it was. But it turns out that we have found fossils of Homo erectus on islands. And so we have to ask the question, how did they get there? Well, quite a few paleoanthropologists have actually proposed that the way they got there was they built boats. And if they were building boats, not only did they have high intelligence, they might have also been using language, because it would take not just intelligence, but also language to be able to build these boats and then navigate the waterways to find these islands. So I think there's some good circumstantial evidence that Homo erectus was more intelligent than we often give it credit for. Okay, so talking about the Neanderthals, we often have the stereotype of Neanderthals as this sort of very primitive, brute-like being that was like this, early human that was not very smart and just kind of like, walked around bumping into trees, not very intelligent. Well, paleoanthropologists actually see them as having been very, very intelligent. This paleoanthropologist from Washington University, Eric Trinkhaus, said they may have had heavier brows or broader noses or stockier builds, but behaviorally, socially, and reproductively, they were all just people. Another anthropologist says Neanderthals were using technology as advanced as that of contemporary anatomically modern humans, and were using symbolism in much the same way. So I would actually argue that there's really no difference between us and them. It's very clear from some of the evidence that we probably actually interbred with Neanderthals, and in fact there are some what we call hybrids of humans and Neanderthals. So I would say that when we talk about Neanderthals, we're really just talking about a subrace of humans that lived probably in Europe and the Middle East long ago. They were just as human as you and me, and they're not some kind of an ape-like, sort of primitive, brute-like species from which we evolved. There's really no difference between us and them. So a few years ago, there was actually a team of archaeologists that tried to create an exhibit of Neanderthals, and as soon as they did this, it was immediately said on the internet, oh, this one looks a lot like Chuck Norris, okay? And so this, of course, immediately led to various Chuck Norris jokes, like, if Chuck Norris was a Neanderthal, he'd still be smarter, stronger, and more advanced than you. Or, there is no theory of evolution, just a list of animals that Chuck Norris allows to live. Or, Chuck Norris once kicked a horse in the chin, that's how the giraffe evolved. Okay, so anyway, enough of the Chuck Norris jokes here. But the reality is they looked very, very similar to us. Whoop. Boy, this is not working here, guys. Okay, so there have been claims that the differences between the Neanderthals, Homo erectus, and us are what we would call microevolutionary changes. These are small-scale changes that take place within a species. And one anthropologist said that they can be explained as the microevolutionary effects of size variation, climatic stress, genetic drift, and differential expression of common genes. So we're talking about, again, Chuck Norris again. Small-scale microevolutionary changes. So just some take-home points here, you guys, to wrap this up. How do we explain the origin of humans if the evolutionary story really is not making sense? Well, when we see a new species abruptly appearing in the fossil record, what we're seeing is a new body plan. And new body plans require information in the DNA to be able to explain how they arose. Brian Miller gave you guys a great talk about the information in DNA and how that works. So to build a new type of organism, you need new genetic code. You need new information in the DNA. But where in our experience does new information come from? Information comes from a mind. It comes from an intelligent being. So when we see new species evolving, or not evolving, but arising very abruptly in the fossil record, what we see is a need to explain the abrupt origin of large amounts of new genetic information. One of those quotes called it a genetic revolution. So I would say that this is a telltale sign that an intelligent agent was at work. So some take-home points here. Hominid fossils, again, generally fit into two categories. There are ape-like species and human-like species with a large unbridged gap between them. This morphological gap reflects a Big Bang theory of human evolution or a genetic revolution. And when our genus Homo does appear in the fossil record, it appears abruptly. This does not show we evolved from ape-like precursors, and it challenges standard Darwinian explanations for the origin of humans. And I would say that a Big Bang model of human origins requires the rapid origin of new genetic information, and that testifies to intelligent design. So, to close this up, I think that Chuck Norris would approve of this, and here's why. I actually got a hold of the official Chuck Norris fact book, and here's what it says. It says, I believe in microevolution, genetic mutations that provide small variations at different species in the animal kingdom. But I don't believe those micromutations lead to macroevolution, large genetic jumps that turn one animal into another, such as apes into humans. So all I can say is, not bad, Chuck. That's pretty well said for a Neanderthal. So thank you guys very much. Oh, and one last thing. If you guys want, Brian and I actually contributed to a book published by a South African academic publisher, and it's a free ebook online. If you click this or scan this QR code with your phone, you can download this book for free and read what Brian and I have to say in more detail. So thank you guys a lot.
So, great, guys. So, what are we going to do now? So, we're going to end our live, the live. Ons gaan die live uitsending eindig, is laat in die aand. En goed gegaan tot daar. Great. Kom ons gee half terug en dan begin ons met vrae. Die ouens wat wil bly is meer as welkom. Dan gaan ons klomp vrae, kan jy vra. So daar gaan 'n mikrofoon beweeg tussen almal. En dan kan ons vra vir hulle in Engels. Amen. Okay, great. Half, almal terug. Dankie. Vat gou 'n koffiebreek sien julle nou.